Good morning. My name is Tyler Field, Vice President of Wine and Spirits for Morton's of Chicago. Today we're going to be talking about Scotch whiskey. There's lots of whiskeys, but there's only one Scotch whiskey. And one of the things that we have here at Morton's is a great selection of what is called Scotch whiskey, including blended whiskeys and single malt whiskeys. So what is Scotch whiskey? Well, it's actually a whiskey made in the country of Scotland. And why are they making whiskey in the country of Scotland? Well, they can't grow grapes there, so you can't really make wine. They had beer, but this is their eau de vie, their spirit of choice that's been around for about 4 to 5 centuries. And there's a lot of particular laws around what is considered single malt, what is considered blended. It can be very confusing, so I just thought we'd take a little time today to kind of walk through the Scotch whiskies in all its different expressions. So starting with probably the most common Scotch that you're familiar with is what we call blended Scotch. And what that means is they can actually take different batches from different parts of Scotland and blend them together with a master distiller and make sure that it tastes exactly the same year after year after year. So this is a very good quality Scotch. Again, they make 4 or 5 different levels. In those levels, you'll see Johnnie Walker Red, Johnnie Walker Blue, Johnnie Walker Gold, and they're really all a different variation of different blends, but they're more expensive because those blends become older and older and older as you go up the ladder of the different colors. Now, the true passion of Scotland, however, is their single malts. And the single malt Scot producing regions in Scotland are pretty much split into 2 ways. In the northern end of Scotland is what's called Islay. And the Islay scotches that are made up here, one here is from Laphroaig, use more peat. So you're really going to get that kind of peaty flavor that you've always talked about, because up by the ocean in that place, what they use to dry the actual barley malt on the floor before they distill it is actually they'll put a lot of peat in the fire, and that adds a real smokiness and texture to Islay scotches. We serve the Laphroaig here, and again, the difference between Islay and then the Speyside scotches, which we'll talk about next, is the Islay scotches are going to be a lot more peaty, and you have Laphroaig and Lagavulin is another one, and the names obviously of all of these single malts are Gaelic. So Laphroaig means nice mill by the bay. And we'll get into Glenlivet and Speyside, but obviously when you see Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, and different items like that, the word Glen means the valley where the actual distillery is. And when you talk about all of these, I mean, what does it take to make whiskey? Well, you obviously need barley grain to make a single malt, but also the other most important factor is water. So when you find all these distilleries in Scotland, the water source is so important that they actually name tell you where it is. It's in the glen, which has a specific water source, and the water is going to affect the flavor as well. And we're actually here at Morton's having 25 kind of events going through all the different years of Glenlivet. We're going to do a tasting in April and May and March. Please check mortons.com for the one that's in your region. But we are going to have whiskey professors come in that are actually going to take us through the different ages of Scotch. Because one thing you do find in single malt Scotches is by law they have to be aged in casks for 3 years. However, most Scotches that are on the market that aren't blended actually start at 10 years, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But again, for a single malt Scotch, you need to only use barley malt. Okay, for a blended Scotch, you can use corn, maize, wheat, and etc. But barley malt barley is the only grain that's used for actual malting and single malt. And when you look at a bottle and it says 12-year whiskey, that means, and it's a single malt, it has to come from a singular pot still from the same distillery. Now, all of the Scotch in here is not 12 years old. However, most of the Scotch is 12-year-old. And then they have different tanks of Scotch that they've also aged that they blend to it to keep a consistent character. There's no way you could have any type of consistency if the total production in each of these bottles was actually just from one pot still. It would be almost different from year to year to year. So there is some blending in all Scotch, but this all came from the same house. Probably the most popular and most expensive Scotch in the world is made by the Macallan. And one of the things that the Macallan does very, very well is they actually are true to form with how Scotch used to be aged. And what would happen is that the casks, England used to bring in a lot of sherry from Spain, and obviously alcohol is very, very, very delicate and will take up the flavors of oak, so you can't use new oak. So what they used to do in Scotland is they used to use all the sherry casks that would come over from Spain, because it was too expensive for all the casks to be brought back empty, so they started to distill them in sherry casks. Now obviously we don't drink as much sherry anymore. The Macallan is a huge company, so what do? They actually buy the barrels now for sherry producers in Spain, have them use it for a few years, and then send it back. What you'll find in these other expressions as well is they're not using new oak at all. A lot of these companies, even though they're in Scotland, are borrowing bourbon barrels, port barrels, different barrels that have already mellowed to make their product. But still to this day, Macallan uses sherry casks. It's an extra cost, and that's why they're a little bit more expensive, but that's the true expression of single malt from 200 years ago, 300 years ago. So what we have here is a Macallan 18-year-old, as well as a Macallan 25-year-old. And obviously the higher you go up in age, the more expense you're going to pay, because obviously they've been paying rent on this beautiful Scotch that's been sitting in barrels for that many years. So now, everyone always asks, how do you pour Scotch? How do you savor Scotch? Well, there's a couple varies of thought. Most of the Scotch producers in the world say you want to drink it neat. And all that neat means is that it's just poured straight up. And I'll use Glenlivet here. And in Scotland, this is called 1 dram, which is about 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces. And this way, if you swirl the Scotch a little bit, it's a little bit like wine. And again, the pleasure is going to be in your nose again. It's not just going to be in your mouth. It's something to be savored. Now, also a lot of people will like to add just maybe 1 cube of ice, or 2, I'm sorry, and swirl it around a little bit. And what this does is sometimes water will dilute the Scotch a little bit, but it also gets the esters and the aromas kind of flowing a little bit more, and you're not going to have that harsh bite. So whichever way you like, your preference is, one thing you should never do, especially with a fine Scotch, is fill it up with ice and dilute it, because you're just not going to get the great experience. Now, one of the things that's in vogue right now, both at Morton's for our Scotch tastings as well as entertaining in the home, is you'll see a lot of Scotch dinners now, a lot of Scotch food pairings and things like that, because, you know, obviously they serve great food in Scotland as well. So our corporate chef, Mr. Chris Rook, has prepared 2 great dishes here that go well if you're entertaining at home with the Scotch. Hi, Chris. How you doing?
What's up, Tyler?
Good. Hey, so tell us a little bit about what we have prepared here.
Well, on this plate we have a French baguette sliced, dipped in olive oil, with a little tenderloin on top, and then blue cheese melted over it. And these are our smoked salmon canapes. They come on toast points. A little smoked salmon, horseradish, and a little chive.
So are these easy to make at home?
They're very easy to make. All the ingredients are readily available in any store. These recipes and a lot of other great hors d'oeuvres that are good for tasting such as this are all in our Morton's cookbooks, available at any major bookstore and at mortons.com.
So the reason why we would pick these 2 things is obviously what's Scotland also famous for? Smoked salmon. So it's obviously a wonderful accompaniment to a Scotch. A Scotch is going to give you a salty, peaty flavor, and the salmon and even the horseradish is going to be able to bite the alcohol. And the other thing, beef is always a great pairing with Scotch as well as a spirit, because obviously it's aged in oak, which is going to give Scotch some tannin. So it's almost like pairing with a good red wine. It's going to have high alcohol. It's going to have some tannin from the oak, and so therefore it's a perfect accompaniment to kind of rich foods like meats and cheeses. So this is a really good representation of that, with a little blue cheese, a little filet, and on top of crostini. You really want rich foods or foods that are salty and savory to go with great Scotches. So both of these would be great. You can entertain your friends at home. And salut. Thank you, Chris, very, very much.